Good morning and hello, everybody. Welcome to the Idaho Department of Labor's Generations in the Workforce webinar. We are very happy to have everyone with us here this morning and hear our labor economist Sam Wolkenhauer's presentation. But first, we'll get to some housekeeping. The Idaho Department of Labor is Idaho's home for job seekers and employers. We can open doors to new skills, job opportunities, and better pay. And we can connect Idaho's employers with job seekers through a number of means, which include registered apprenticeships, which can serve as an effective pipeline that can help address the worker shortage. Registered apprenticeships offer paid on-the-job training, a nationally recognized credential at graduation, and a well-paying job. Today's presentation from Sam will run for about 40 to 45 minutes, after which there will be a Q&A. Please submit whatever questions you may have in the Q&A below, and we will ask Sam at the end of his presentation. Also, just as an FYI, this presentation is being recorded, and we will make it available to you for later viewing. With that, we'll get started and get on to Sam's presentation. Sam Wolkenhauer has been with the department as the labor economist at Idaho's northern region since 2015. Prior to joining the Department of Labor, he earned degrees in mathematics and economics from Eastern Washington University. In addition to providing economic data and analysis to the citizens of Northern Idaho, he manages several forecasting projects for the state, including short and long-term projections of Idaho's labor market conditions and demographics. Again, good morning, everybody, and I'll turn it over to Sam. And Sam, it's all yours.
What we're going to be doing today is kind of taking a step back and examining an issue that's pretty ubiquitous right now, and that is the availability of labor. Pretty much everywhere you go, you see help wanted signs. Employers are struggling to find people. And rather than looking at this at a really close-up look at how the labor market is functioning, we want to step back and kind of think about the big picture of the labor supply, the labor market, and demographics. And so that's what we're going to do, is we're going to try to get a big picture view of what's going on with the economy and explain the labor supply issue from that perspective. So the issues that we're going to discuss today are going to center around labor supply and demographics. And what we're going to see as we move through here is that these are really the same issue. Okay, and so when we strip away the minutia and the immediate concerns of hiring and wages, and inflation, and all these things that are going on, and not minimizing those things. Obviously, inflation is important, for example. We're going to find out that kind of under the hood, there are some structural changes going on that are really impacting the economy in major ways, and they're going to continue to have a major impact on the way the economy functions. Okay, so we're going to just jump right into this, and I kind of want to present this overall look at Idaho's labor market. Okay, so this is a data series that we call total non-farm jobs. This is one of our high-level looks at Idaho's labor market. And this is actually a really kind of striking graph if you know what you're looking at, because we're looking over the course of a decade, and leading up to COVID, that's that red line there, the pandemic. Leading up to the pandemic, Idaho's labor market almost looks like a straight line. The consistency with which it was growing at a very rapid pace was quite striking. Okay? And then it takes a big nosedive during the pandemic, obviously, but we bounce back pretty fast. Idaho became the first state to bounce all the way back, get all those jobs back, and then we basically continue that straight line path in 2021. So Idaho is going on close to a decade of really rapid labor force growth and labor market growth and job growth, and everything looks fantastic. But then in 2022, we start to run into a problem. And the problem is that we can't create jobs at the pace we used to because we're having a hard time filling those jobs, right? Because we have essentially exhausted most of the available labor. And we've reached a point where Idaho businesses can continue to create jobs, but it's going to prove very, very difficult to fill those jobs. Okay? And so that is the basic situation that we find ourselves in now. And we can actually see what that labor shortage looks like graphically, right? It's easy to see this anecdotally. If you go around, there are help wanted signs everywhere. Every restaurant, every hotel, every business, it seems, has positions they can't fill. but we can depict this with a nice little graph as well. So we're kind of just looking at a pretty simple relationship. Okay, how many open jobs are there in the state? That's the blue line. And how many people are there available to fill those jobs, right? That's the red line, the unemployed. 2016 through 2020, so leading up to the pandemic, this is a labor market that's close to equilibrium, okay? So the number of people that are unemployed is close to the number of open jobs. Now, obviously, that's not going to be a one-for-one fit. So for example, if you're trying to hire a nurse or a programmer or an engineer, someone with a really robust skill set, you probably were not going to find someone with those skills that was unemployed. But the thing we notice is the number of job openings is pretty stable up through early 2020. It's not really growing, which means we're doing a pretty good job filling those open jobs. They're not stacking up, piling up. There's a pretty consistent level of hiring going on. Okay, so this is a mostly functioning market here. Well, then we have COVID. COVID obviously disrupts this in a major way. You get a huge spike in the number of unemployed people, but that's temporary, right? And it begins to come down. And then after COVID is when we start to notice a problem. Because after COVID, something new begins to happen. And that is that the number of open jobs in Idaho begins to pile up, right? It's beginning to accumulate and grow. So whereas pre-pandemic, we had maybe 20,000 open jobs at any given point in time, today it's well over 3 times that number. And it certainly far exceeds the number of people available to fill those jobs. Okay, so we're observing that the number of open positions is beginning to pile up because we're having more and more difficulty filling those positions. Okay, so this is what we call a labor shortage. There aren't enough people to fill all the open jobs, so it's beginning to accumulate and stack up. Okay, so this is from an aggregate data perspective. This is what we're seeing anecdotally when you notice open positions and people struggling to hire, right? It stacks up on a statewide level and we get a growing number of unfilled jobs. This is also creating difficulties for employers because when there aren't a lot of unemployed people available to fill your jobs, what do? Well, the only real way to fill those jobs is to try to entice someone who already has a job. So we can call this, poaching or cannibalizing or whatever term you want to use for it, but it's growing, right? So we can actually measure this. We can look at wage growth and we can divide workers into 2 categories, okay? People who stay in their existing job over the year, okay? So if you stay in your job, what raise are you going to get? And then we have people who switch jobs. They leave for a different job, and we can look at how much of a wage gain are they making. And normally, and this is actually kind of interesting, normally switching jobs will get you a bigger raise than just staying in your existing job, okay? So moving careers, moving to new jobs, that's one of the main ways that workers drive wage gains. But normally that gap isn't huge. Normally the benefit from switching jobs is only about an extra 1% on top of staying in the job you're in. But now that there's a labor shortage, people that are trying to fill jobs, hiring managers, they're getting more and more desperate. They're throwing bigger and bigger offer sheets trying to coax people over. And so the gap is growing. Okay, so workers who switched jobs in 2022, their wage gains were almost 9% year over year. Right? I mean, that's actually pretty incredible, considering, on average, wages are only growing 3 to 4% over the long run. People are making almost 9% wage gains by switching jobs. And that reflects all this competition in the labor market. People are raising wages, trying to coax people over. They're conducting this poaching, cannibalization process. And all of this simply reflects the fact there are not enough workers right now. And so employers are desperate and they're really throwing higher and higher wages at candidates trying to get people in. Okay, so we definitively have a labor shortage. All of these measurements, really any measurement you want to look at, whether it's the unemployment rate, which is very, very low, whether it's the number of job openings, which is growing, the wage growth, the number of people who are quitting and switching jobs, it's all consistent with this story that we have a labor shortage. Okay, so the question becomes, what is wrong with the labor supply? Where are all the workers? Okay, so there are a few things we can throw out here, right? Okay, skill level mismatch, education, training, right? And we know that there are people who need to or want to upskill, get new training, start new careers. There are people who need to have their skill sets rejuvenated. Maybe they've been out of the labor force for a while and need retraining, right? There is some of that. We do have issues with retirements. We always knew that retirements were going to be an issue. We're going to talk about that more in a little bit, but COVID accelerated that, right? COVID caused a lot of early retirements, people who maybe they were worried about getting sick, they didn't want to have to adjust to working from home, so they retired a year or two early. So it pushed the retirements up a bit, and that strains the labor supply. We have disabilities of despair. This is a group category. It refers to 3 different conditions: drug abuse, alcohol abuse, and depression. Okay? And obviously this is a moral issue, it's a public health issue, but it's also an economic issue because nationally these problems keep hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people from being able to live productive lives and hold jobs. Okay, so that hurts the labor supply. And then we know we have issues with childcare availability. Okay, and childcare availability, as we know, keeps a lot of parents from being able to work, especially if you have to have multiple children in childcare. Either the lack of availability or the cost can simply make it so that the math doesn't work out to go to work and send your kids to daycare. And daycare, incidentally, is a very difficult industry to to provide enough space for because it's a difficult industry to staff. And people that want to work with children, they tend to prefer to work in the school districts. The wages are significantly better. Working in a daycare is essentially minimum wage work in most places. So it just makes sense that they would gravitate towards the school districts because the hours are better, the pay is better. So it's really hard to get enough workers in daycare facilities. So there's always a limited availability and it makes it very expensive. And we can talk about any of these things, and these are important things. Education's important, disability, childcare, it's all important. But what I would suggest is that these issues are about trying to make the most out of your demographics, right? How can we get the most workers out of the population and the demographics that we have? So if the demographics are bad, if the population if the population structure is just not conducive to economic growth, then all we're doing with these things is we're trying to tinker and make the best out of a bad situation, right? It's about maximizing the demographics. And if the demographics are bad, then there's only so much mileage you can get out of policy solutions and tinkering with education and things like that. And so what I'm going to show you is that fundamentally, while we don't want to minimize any of these issues, the central problem is that the demographics are quite bad right now. And so we're going to look at that and we're going to see how it's actually demographics that are really hindering labor availability. Okay, so the thing that we want to notice is actually the labor force participation for prime age workers. Okay, that's what we call 25 to 54-year-olds. And incidentally, the reason we call them prime isn't because you can't be productive after 54. It's because 25 to 54 years old on paper is when you're done with school, but you're too young to take an early retirement, right? So these are kind of the years where most people are expected to work. And actually, participation, the number of workers we're getting out of this population is pretty stable over the last 10 to 15 years. It doesn't seem like there's any kind of huge disruption here. Okay, so it doesn't seem like childcare or education or any of these other problems are making an enormous dent in the labor force. So it must be something else. And namely, it's demographics. So that's what I want to look at now. But before I look at our demographics, I want to show you a couple of other countries because I want us to kind of learn how to think about demographics, right? It's a very particular, discrete sort of topic. And so I want to kind of walk you through how we think about demographics and how it relates to workers. Okay. This is the demographic in China. Now, the reason I'm showing you China is because I think it really illustrates the point that I want to make here. So let's kind of walk through this. This graph might look intimidating at first, but these graphs are actually very, very easy to read once you know what you're looking at. So this is what we call a population pyramid. Side note, I realize this is not a pyramid, but about 200 years ago, these all looked exactly like pyramids and the name just stuck. Okay, so this is the standard way of showing demographics with a graph. You have male and female on opposite sides, and every bar shows the size of the population in a age group 5 years old, okay? So for example, the bottom bar is 0 to 5-year-olds, 5 to 10-year-olds, 10 to 15, so on and so forth, right? So you have children on the bottom, working age in the middle, seniors on the top. Okay, so just for example, how we would read this, in China, there are a little over 40 million boys between 0 and 5 years old, right? The bottom bar on the right hand. Okay, so that's how we read this. And you don't even really need to read the numbers. We can extract a lot of the meaning from the shape. Okay, so what we see with China is running out of 30-year-olds. There's a huge population that's 30 to 35 years old. And then there's about 18 million fewer for each gender. So we're talking about almost 40 million fewer overall that are 25 to 30. There's a big drop off after the age of 30 years old. Now, why is that? Well, that's because China's one-child policy was adopted about 30 years ago. Okay? So what happened in China was they limited the size of families and the number of children began to drop off 30 years ago. And they were children at the time, but now they're the working population. So China has a very unstable demographic shape because the bulk of its population, really the mass of the Chinese population, is roughly between the age of 45 and 70. Okay, so it's a very old and rapidly aging society as a result of those population control policies. Now, this has a really big impact on our world. Okay, right now, there are 1.3 billion Chinese people, okay, 1.3 billion Chinese citizens. By some of the United Nations forecasts, there might only be 600 to 700 million by the end of the century. Okay, so we're talking about a country that potentially could have half of its current population by the end of the century, and it's all due to this population structure and the low number of children that they're having. Right, and this sort of elucidates the central point here. Okay, when we talk about the number of children per family, it can be a bit of a tricky conversation because on the level of an individual family, obviously this is a very personal decision. It's nobody's business but their own, right? It's not anybody's place to tell you how many children you have to have. But when you extrapolate the number of children to the whole country, it determines the shape of your future. Okay, so for example, if every family has 4 children, then the population and the number of workers will double when the handoff is made from parent to child generation. You have 2 parents, 4 children, okay, it's a doubling. Okay? It's just simple math. When, as in the case of China, you only have 1 child per family, the population gets cut in half during the handoff from parent to child generations. So you can think, oh my goodness, how on earth is a country supposed to shrink in half by the end of the century? That's kind of insane. We're not used to thinking like that. Well, that's the basic mathematical result of 1 child per family, right? So when we talk about number of children per family, on an individual basis, it's a personal decision. But when you extrapolate it to the whole country, it has very serious implications for the country and the world as a whole. Okay, so China is a good illustration of unstable demographics. They're aging very quickly. And what do you think is going to happen to the Chinese labor force as their population shrinks? Well, they are, of course, going to have ubiquitous labor shortages, and they're already really struggling with this. China's labor force hit its high point about 3 years ago, and it's begun to shrink pretty quickly. Okay, let's look at one more foreign demographic profile before we look at the US. Okay, this is the European Union. Okay, now the European Union is missing something that America has. Okay, they're missing millennials. Now, one of the interesting things about demographics is that pretty much every country in the world has baby boomers. Everywhere you go, there's a big generation in their 50s and 60s. Okay? Europe is just like the United States in that regard. Lots of people in that boomer demographic. But the European boomers did not have 2 children per family the way America's boomers did. So Europe is missing a big millennial demographic. And in fact, Europe's birth rate really took a nosedive in the 1990s, right when the millennials were being born here in America. So we have a situation where Europe's population drops off significantly, roughly after the age of 30, very similar to what you saw in China. So Europe is also aging very quickly, and it's because they don't have this millennial demographic to offset the baby boomers retiring. Right? And as we're going to see in a moment when we look at the United States, it's that millennial boomer relationship that's so important in America. I'm not talking about, the interpersonal relationship. We're talking about economically that handoff between the generations. Okay, so in Europe, the bulk of the population is, in the 40s through early 70s. So this is also a workforce that's aging and shrinking over time, because there simply are not enough young people in their 20s and teens coming into the workforce to offset the number of retirees, right? So for example, the number of people between 60 and 65 in Europe is about 10 million larger than the number of people between 15 and 20. Okay, so the number of people that are going to retire is going to vastly outnumber the new people coming into the workforce. Okay? And this is because Europe doesn't have millennials. Well, they do, they just don't have a lot of them like we do here in the United States. Okay, so having kind of seen what's going on with China and Europe, and I could show you other countries and it would look very, very similar. Japan and South Korea are aging very quickly, right? This is kind of a ubiquitous issue across the developed world, the industrialized world. So now let's look at the United States. We actually see this looks a little better. This is a little more flat and stable, but there's still some interesting things going on here. So let's talk about Americans. What types of Americans are there from a generational perspective? Well, up here, these are your baby boomers. There's 71 million of them. That's quite a lot. At the time that they were born, they were the biggest generation ever. Now, why are there so many baby boomers? Well, the reason is pretty simple. The average boomer grew up in a house with 4 children. The average baby boomer has 3 siblings. Now remember what we said, 4 children per family. The workforce is going to double in size during that handoff from parent to child. And actually, in the case of the boomers, it more than doubled because the boomers were the first generation where a majority of women were working as well. So not only was it a big generation, but it was also a big generation where women were working along with men. So there was a huge growth in the labor force as the baby boomers came of age. Okay, so there's 71 million of them up there. And their age is pretty interesting because right now, 2022, sort of a coincidental fact, 2022 is the year where we're exactly halfway through the baby boomer retirements. Okay, half of them are retired, half of them are not. So we are well into the process of losing this large generation out of the workforce. Okay, below the baby boomers comes Gen X. Now, every time I give a presentation about demographics, someone asks, why doesn't Gen X get any attention? Why doesn't anyone talk about them? Well, there's 2 reasons. Number one, there just aren't that many of them, right? There's 5 million fewer than the boomers. Secondly, they're just going to work. They're basically between 40 and 55 right now. They're not retiring yet. They've already bought homes. They've long done with college. They've started families. So they're just in that kind of stable, don't rock the boat phase of life. They get up, they go to work in the morning. That's wonderful. We need that, but they're not really causing any problems, not really making anybody upset here. So they just don't get talked about. They're just kind of that well-behaved middle child, right? Then below Gen X is the millennials. Okay, and there are 72 million millennials, barely outnumbering the baby boomers. Now, why are there so many millennials? Well, the boomers are numerous because they grew up in big families. Okay, they grew up with 3 siblings. The millennials are numerous because they're the children of the boomers, and there are a lot of boomers. Okay, so the average baby boomer household had a little over 2 children per family. So they're smaller families than they grew up in. But because there are so many boomers, you just end up with a lot of millennials on aggregate. So kind of the way we can think about this is there are lots of baby boomers because they grew up in big families. Millennials grew up in smaller families, but more families. So you end up with a lot of them on aggregate, okay? So let's think about this for a second. We have 2 big generations, boomers and millennials. These are parent-child generations. The gap between them is very, very important because the gap suggests that we would have a limited window of opportunity where both of the big generations are working at the same time. Okay, so we can think of this as a demographic Goldilocks zone. We would get to double dip on both of the big generations, parent and child at the same time. And while we're double dipping on the big generations, we're going to have plenty of workers, okay? But once the double dipping comes to an end, suddenly we're going to face labor strain. Okay, and this is sort of the dominant demographic picture as we're going to see here. Below the millennials comes Gen Z. Again, there are not that many of them. So if you're counting on Gen Z to offset the boomers retiring, well, you're going to be about 4 million people short, okay? And this is the basic structure of our demographics and the reason why we have a labor shortage. Because for the last 10 years or so, we had it good. Boomers and millennials were working at the same time. You get to double dip on the 2 big groups, plenty of workers, labor market functions fine, and we get to look at China and Japan and all these places that are shrinking and go, wow, I'm glad that's not us. We've got plenty of workers. But then the double dipping comes to an end. The boomers begin to retire, and instead of both big generations working, we're going to be left with just one. And then we get to join these other countries with labor force constraints as the demographics shift against us and not in our favor. Okay, so let's briefly look at Idaho here. Idaho is an interesting state because if you just look at the average age of the state, the median age, Idaho is actually one of the youngest states in the country. I believe it's 7th youngest. And so you might look at that and go, wow, if Idaho is one of the younger states, then we must have plenty of workers, right? We must have a robust workforce. And actually that's not true. And it's because we're almost too young in a certain way. So what I want you to do, I'm going to switch over to the Idaho graph. And when I do that, I want you to keep your eye on the millennials, keep your eye on the green band here. So when we move over, what we notice is that our millennials seem to go away. So whereas nationally there's a bulge where the millennials are between 25 and 35, in Idaho, we have a bulge in the teens and under. So what happened to Idaho was this. Over the last 10 to 15 years, we had a portion of our millennials skimmed off the top. They moved to other states to go to school and to work. Okay, so we had millennials skimmed off the top, and that means fewer young workers. But what we had offsetting that was people moving here to start families. So we ended up, Idaho has, a fairly high percentage of the population that's under 18, but a lower percentage that's millennials. Now, it's good that this is a state where people want to raise families. For all the complications that growth brings, I will just say it, it's good to live in a state that people want to live in, right? So it's good that people want to raise families here. But the fact that we had millennials skimmed off the top, so Idaho is relatively, let's just say we're light on the millennials, means we face labor issues that maybe come to a head a little earlier than in other states. So Idaho's demographic profile is roughly like America's, but the main difference is we have fewer millennials, we're lighter on millennials, and we're a little heavier on families. Okay, so we're the 7th youngest state, and a lot of that is due to the fact that we have more families with kids in their teens. Okay, and it's good that people want to raise families here, but we need those young people to stay in Idaho and work once they turn 18, because it strains our labor situation if they leave to go to other states to work and go to college. And you can actually see that because if you look here, the bar, the 20-year-old bar from 20 to 25, it's actually on both sides, it's quite a bit shorter than the bars on either side of it. And that represents young people leaving to go to college in other states, right? So we get our young people skimmed off the top as they turn 18 and go to college. So all of this leads up to what ultimately is a very simple equation, but it's the equation that will really determine what happens with your economy, okay? And I've affectionately termed this the labor death cross, just because it's a nice dramatic name and then people will pay attention to it. Arguably the most important graph in the whole sequence here. There's a simple question. How many people turned 65 this year and how many people turned 18? Right? Because there is an in and outflow of the working age population. Right? It's kind of like a conveyor belt. Every year, the 65-year-olds, you know, most of them go out and the 18-year-olds come in, and that repeats every year like clockwork because we all age at the same rate, 1 year at a time. And so we can just say how many people came in and how many people came out of the labor force. We'll look at 2012 through 2020, the early part of the graph. This is in our favor. A lot more people are turning 18 than 65. In some cases, well over 1 million extra per year. So under those conditions, we're going to have enough workers, right? The labor force is going to grow and everything will be fine. But over time, look at that blue line. It's beginning to ramp up. That's the boomers. They're turning 65, more and more of them every year. Their retirements are starting to pick up pace and accelerate. And then right around the years 2021, 2022, which is this year, the lines cross over each other. And suddenly we're in the red and more people are going out than are coming in. And just based on our demographic shape, that is going to be the case for the foreseeable future. So when you talk about education and childcare availability and all these other issues, and these are important issues, we don't want to belittle them. Ultimately, you are fighting against something of an unstoppable force here because we are powerless to stop aging. We're powerless to reverse and change demographics. If we wanted more 18-year-olds, we needed to do something about it over 18 years ago, right? There's nothing you can do to change the shape of these graphs, okay? And so right now, we are fighting against the brute reality of time, so to speak. Right? And every year, more people are going to turn 65 than 18, and the labor force is going to be shrinking in the face of demographic decline. So let's look at this over the long run. Right? So this is by decade. Right? This is average working age growth by decade. Okay? Look at the 90s, the 2000s. Everything's going to be fine. Right? The labor force is growing by over 1.5, over 2 million people per year. Of course, there's going to be plenty of workers. The economy will grow robustly. Everything will be great. You get to the 2010s, danger signs are flashing. It's still growing, but it craters off a lot. Right? You go from about 2.2 million growth per year to 700,000, right? So it's a big drop off, but it's still positive. So this kind of allows us to look the other way and not notice this reality quite yet. But then we cross over into baby boomer mass retirement and the line goes red. And now instead of year after year labor force growth, we're facing year over year labor force decline driven purely by the demographics. And we can try to fight back against this with education policy and things like that. But ultimately, we only have so much traction. There's only so much we can do in the face of demographic decline. Let's look at Idaho real quick. And Idaho, in particular, is facing this acutely because we have an aging state, because we're a highly valuable destination, a highly desirable place to live for retirees. So this is the population growth in Idaho, just kind of broken up by age group. Under 15s And then you have the working ages and then the retirees. And just for the ease of reading this, blue is the last 10 years, red is our projection for the next 10 years. And I don't really need to add too much narration here. You can see how heavily weighted this is towards the retirees, right? So retirees moving here is not intrinsically bad, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It drives demand for housing and services, but it does strain the labor supply. And we do end up in a situation where we are going to be perennially short on workers to meet demand. So we can kind of circle back to that opening question. Where are the workers? Well, I would suggest the workers are working. Employment in Idaho is at an all-time high. You can say, well, where are the construction workers, right? We need construction workers. Construction employment in Idaho is very, very high right now. It's just not enough to meet demand because there simply are not enough working age people to fill all the jobs. So when we ask that question, where are the workers? They are working. Unemployment in this state is very, very low. The number of people claiming unemployment benefits is very, very low. We have a robust labor market that has grown very, very quickly over the last decade, and the workers are working, and there's just no more of them. And that's the simple reality. And that's being driven by demographics. So ultimately, when we talk about the decline of the labor force, this is being driven by demographics and it's being driven by retirement. So this black line shows the decline in the percentage of the adult population that's working, right? And we can ask what's causing that. Okay, well, we can actually attribute this to various causes. Okay, so the blue bars, for example, are the portion contributed by disabilities. The green line encompasses all those other things, lack of training, lack of childcare, family commitments, things like that. But that big old red bar, which is just growing year after year, that's people retiring. Okay, so even if you could get rid of all the disability and health issues, all the education problems, train everybody to exacting standards and provide perfectly adequate childcare, you're never going to get the labor force up to where it used to be, right? Because all we can really do here, and we can think of it this way, we can try to fight back maybe against the green and the blue part of these bars, but the red bars are there to stay because that's demographics, that's people turning 65 and retiring. And over time, this just becomes a bigger and bigger share of the problem. And we're left with less and less ability to combat this. Okay, so ultimately, we need to understand that we are kind of trapped in the grip of something that is a lot more powerful than us, okay? And that is time, and it's aging, and it's demographic structure, right? And on a personal level, we feel this. We feel the capricious march of time eroding our body. Well, maybe that's just me eroding my body over time. It's probably because I have a kid, and that's why I'm tired all the time. But on a societal basis, we feel this as well, right? Inexorably, we get older. And as that happens, our country is going to run lower and lower on workers. Okay? And this is a situation that countries like Japan and China and Germany have been used to for a long time. We were just late to the party because we had so many millennials. Okay, so let's kind of try to recap this. So we need to understand that we are going through a demographic transition that is straining not just our economy, but the global economy. And that demographic transition is easy to describe very succinctly, okay? There was an enormous baby boomer generation globally, and they're entering mass retirement. So this transition fundamentally is linked to the fact that the biggest generation in human history is retiring en masse right now. And so as a result, the world is just becoming older, and that makes things more expensive because labor markets are going to be tight. There aren't going to be enough workers, and it's going to drive wages up and limit production. Okay, so we need to understand when we look at this and we ask, well, where are the workers? You know, why is everything so different? Is this due to the pandemic? Are we going to go back to normal? Well, normal has fundamentally changed, and it's changed because of this demographic aspect, right? And so as the country gets older, as the world gets older, we're going to become accustomed to permanently tight labor markets. And we can tinker with that and push back at that with education and training and all these other policies. And in a way, those become more important, right? Because this is not a demographic situation where we're just going to coast through on autopilot, right? But we need to understand that we are facing permanent labor tightness as a result of this demographic transition. And while we have no ability to steer this, right? So if we wanted more 18-year-olds, we needed to do something about that a couple decades ago. But it's important to know what's going on so that we're not in the dark about this major transition that's happening kind of underneath our feet, as it were. So with that, we have, I believe, 10 to 15 minutes for questions. So I would love to take your questions now, and I think Craig is going to manage the Q&A.
Yes, thank you, Sam. Very good presentation. Thank you for running us through that, and very important information. As an oversight, I forgot to introduce myself at the beginning. My name is Craig Shaw, and I'm the Labor Economist Supervisor for the state Idaho Department of Labor. There's no questions there, but if you have anything you want to ask Sam, be sure to put that in there. And in the meantime, I'll ask a couple questions to Sam. One thing that I thought might be interesting to hear your take on, Sam, is that, you know, retirements and people aging has always been a kind of a factor of demographics. And obviously this is a larger population, but is there anything else that's different with this kind of demographic of retirements being so big compared to maybe in history that makes this one stand out?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about baby boomers is that compared to previous generations, they're hitting their retirements in a state of both good health and wealth, essentially. Previous generations, and partially this is because there was so much manual labor. If we think about 100 years ago, people didn't have affluent retirements, right? You generally were not in particularly good health. You didn't have a lot of disposable income, but baby boomers have significant disposable income. And of course, there's variations, but as a generation, the boomers are in pretty good financial shape, and they're generally pretty healthy. So the thing about boomers that's different than other generations when they retire is they're going to continue to be pretty stable consumers, right? And so that adds to demand. They move after they retire, they buy new homes, they recreate. So the boomers are bigger consumers than previous generations of retirees were because of their health and their wealth.
All right, thank you, Sam. We do have some questions in the chat, and I will go through those as we have time for. What proportion of the current job openings, that, if you're aware, are low, medium, or high skilled?
So I don't have the numbers at my fingertips. I don't want to give you an incorrect statistic, so I'll just speak in generalities. There are labor needs across the full ladder of skills in Idaho right now. So you see us just, you know, kind of as an example, you will see a significant number of openings in restaurants and hotels, and you also see huge openings in hospitals and tech, right? So we need people at the lower end of the skill set, young people to fill service sector jobs, but we also need programmers, engineers, and surgeons, right? So the full ladder of skill sets is in demand right now.
Thank you, Sam. And this one's a little bit open-ended, but could you speak to the changes to immigration over time? Anything that might help, I guess, alleviate this? And kind of related to the stuff you had seen, it seems like this is a global issue. So what are the implications for maybe reforming immigration and getting more of that population to alleviate the labor force problem?
Yeah, so the thing about immigration is that on paper, immigration can fix your labor shortages, right? It's really the only mechanism for tinkering with your demographics and boosting the number of workers. However, immigrants, people in general, are more than just workers, right? We're holistic human beings and members of society. So immigration is more than just a labor force issue. So it is not the place of a labor economist to tell anyone what their position should be on a really multifaceted social issue, right? And it's not the place, like I as a labor economist would not deign to go to Japan and tell them you need to, because Japan is notoriously closed off to immigration, right? It's not the place of a labor economist just from a technical perspective to tell Japan that they need to change their immigration policy, right? Because it's a holistic social issue. And so it's just not our place to make a blanket judgment about what should be done with immigration policy, because it's not purely a labor issue.
Great, thank you. There's a question about recording. I'll just answer that real quick. We are recording this, and we will distribute that to the attendees later on. And we'll see about providing a public link to our website there. For Sam, the next question is related to disabilities of despair. What are the implications of getting people back in the labor force, and would that, I guess, how would that affect the challenge that you're laying out?
So the issue of the disabilities of despair it's really kind of come onto people's radar in the last few years. The opioid epidemic, right, was kind of building under the surface, and I think in the last several years everybody's become aware of it. So in terms of addressing that and trying to combat opioid addiction, that's going to be outside the Department of Labor's wheelhouse, so to speak. So you would have to look up and look up the specifics in your area of the opioid response that's going on from other state agencies.
Thank you. And we have 3 questions that are kind of asking the same things in different ways. So I'm just going to ask, there's 2 aspects to it. So just kind of ask this question, which is, can you talk about baby boomers that are staying in the workforce longer? Are they retiring as soon as they can? And likewise, on the other end of the workforce, it seems that the younger age are kind of entering later. Is that affecting these numbers at all? And what are the implications of that for the future?
Yes, so there have been changes to the labor habits of both baby boomers and young people. So on the baby boomer side, they are retiring a little bit later, not all of them, but you have a little bit higher work rates for over 65 people than you had with previous generations. And that's good, but really all that is a delaying tactic, right? Because let's say that a third of the baby boomers retire or at 68 instead of 65, right? That definitely helps, but all you're really getting out of that is a slowing of this effect, because they're not going to work forever. And after the age of 70, workforce participation is very, very low, right? So there's no permanent solution that will come from that. What that represents is a sort of helpful delaying of the demographic transition. And then as to the related question about young people, there have been changes in teen work habits. Work rates for teens are much lower than they were about 20 years ago. So if you could get those work rates up, that would definitely help, mainly with service sector jobs, restaurants, retail, hotels, things like that. Part of the problem with teens right now is that wages, not the problem with teens, part of the problem with teen work right now is that wages are so high that anecdotally what we've begun to see is teens are treating jobs like gig work because their expenses are not very high. And if you can make $17 or $18 an hour at a fast food restaurant, which you absolutely can in some places, you might work for 3 or 4 weeks, make some money, and then you quit and you enjoy your summer. Right? And you know that if you run out of cash, you can easily get a new job because there's openings everywhere, work for a few more weeks, make more money. So they've got this sort of episodic work pattern going on. It's interesting, but it is problematic that they don't hold long-term employment because the wages are so high relative to their expenses.
Okay, thank you. And I'm going to have two questions kind of addressing the same topic. I'll hit you with them both here. Do you have any suggestions for employers on navigating the labor shortage? In addition, are there ways that employers could help determine how to provide goods and services with fewer employees?
Sure. So the second question is kind of about productivity, but more generally, in terms of how to navigate the labor shortage. So I'll preface this by saying I'm not a human resources professional, right? But kind of my message and what I tell people is that going forward, labor availability is going to be one of the preeminent issues for employers, right? So I think that to successfully navigate the new environment as we make this demographic transition, people need to, and employers need to approach labor as if it's a C-suite issue, right? It absolutely has to be a foundational issue because it will be one of the main constraints on the economy. And you're starting to see this. The Small Business Administration does a survey where they ask small businesses, what's your single largest concern right now? And along, obviously, with prices, which are a big issue, every month I check on this, and every month either availability or the cost of skilled labor, adequately trained labor, is just rising and rising and rising. More and more businesses report it as their top concern. And I think that that's going to be a long-term reality for us, that this will be a preeminent concern. So I'm not an expert in terms of how to craft your hiring strategy, but it has to be one of the foundational aspects of your business strategy, and it has to be a key issue going forward, because if you expect to deal with labor on autopilot, I'm skeptical that you'll be successful.
All right. It looks like the last question is basically getting at, given kind of the challenges that the current world is facing with overpopulation, consumption, pollution, and the consumption of limited resources, wouldn't, like, in the long run, the idea of a shrinking population be beneficial?
I am not the man to adjudicate between competing claims of under and overpopulation, because I'm not an environmental scientist. I don't really have a Malthusian instincts as an economist. I can only say that from a labor perspective, having a rapidly aging society is very, very difficult to cope with. And we're seeing countries around the world struggling to cope with this.
All right, thank you. And then, so it looks like it's going to be a job seekers future for the foreseeable future. Is that correct, Sam?
Yeah, we're comfortable with language like buyer's market and seller's market when it comes to houses. And that kind of language should enter our lexicon when we talk about work. And it's going to be a seller's market, because in labor, the seller is the worker. He sells his time and effort to his employer. And the leverage in this market is going to be with workers for the foreseeable future, just by that brutal, unalterable reality of demographics.
Okay, great. All right, Sam. Well, I think that brings us to the end. I'd like to thank everybody for attending our webinar. We close by, I'd like to remind the audience that the Idaho Department of Labor has many services to assist employers and job seekers, and labor market information is an important tool for that. The information is free to the public and available at lmi.idaho.gov. In addition, when you go there, you'll find, or if you just go to lmi.idaho.gov/regions, you'll see a directory for the department's 6 labor economists throughout the state, as well as data sheets for each region and county and the statewide itself. You're welcome to contact the labor economist in your area for information like this, or if you have any questions, you're always welcome to contact Sam, myself, or any of the labor economists in your area. So with that, I would like to conclude and thank everyone for joining us. And thank you again, Sam, for providing your insight.
All right, thank you.
All right. Merry Christmas, everybody. Happy New Year, and we'll talk later.